Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome, welcome to the Network's Friday Forum. My name is Tierra Labrada. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Supportive Housing Network of New York. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the network, we are a membership and advocacy organization promoting the development of supportive housing as the answer to homelessness for individuals with behavioral health needs and other vulnerable populations. In lieu of our annual in-person conference, which usually occurs in June, the network is hosting a series of online panels and workshops that would have mirrored the conference, but also some that will take stock of our current social and political climate as we combat COVID-19 and social unrest due to the resurgence of overt racism in our country. Next week, our panel will focus on how the supportive housing community has supported their staff during the pandemic. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our sponsors for helping us ensure that we can put on these panels for all of you. I also want to give a huge shout out to the Supportive Housing Network team. Everyone give a round of applause to the network team in the chat, specifically Lauren Jefferson and Steve Pisacki, who helped to pull together this panel. I also want to give a huge thank you to Joelle Balam-Schwan and Emily Levine, who produced these panels tirelessly behind the scenes and who are responsible for the amazing elevator music that you just heard while you were waiting for the panel to start. A little bit of housekeeping. We will reserve some time for Q&A at the end of the discussion. Please put your questions in the Q&A, not to be confused with the chat feature. There is a Q&A feature that's also at the end, at the bottom of your screen. And you know, similarly to what we did last week, if you feel like you are hearing something that is inspiring you, if you hear some mic drops or some jewels being dropped, please feel free to share your enthusiasm in the chat. It really helps us to know that you're engaged. And it provides our panelists with a little bit of encouragement and excitement. Today I'm very pleased to be joined by some scholars and organizers in the field of supportive housing and homelessness. We're going to focus on some key policies that have led to the current homelessness crisis, specifically among the Black community. What are some policies that have worked and some that we should be looking out for? And what a just society could look like if we all really think outside of the box. Without further ado, I'm going to ask my panelists to join me on screen. Thank you, thank you. We are joined today by Antoine Lovell, Lorraine Collins, and Maddox, Guerilla. I'm going to allow them all to introduce themselves. Antoine, the floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Antoine Lovell. I'm a scholar practitioner. On the scholarship side, I've authored peer-reviewed articles on supportive housing and housing policies. On the practitioner side, I've worked with homeless populations in New York City, runaway and homeless youth, youth in foster care, and also in low-income housing. My story is very much connected to the work that I've done and also my scholarship. I was homeless in New York City. With my family, I slept on the 3 train, and we ended up at the EAU in the Bronx. And we stayed at Auburn Assessment Center in Brooklyn, and eventually ended up in a Tier 2 shelter in the Bronx. It was through a Section 8 voucher that we were allowed to find housing and become stably housed, and so that I can go to college, that my mother could get back into the labor market. And that's the work that I do. Because I know that when families are stably housed, they are allowed to get back into the world, and it's a right. And I really see housing as a human right.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Antoine, and for all of the work that you do. Lorraine, you got some audience members shouting you out. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, and thank you for those shout outs. Good afternoon, all, or morning if you happen to be on the West Coast. My name is Lorraine Collins. I'm Senior Director of Public Policy and External Affairs for Enterprise Community Partners New York Market Office. In my role as the Senior Director of Public Policy, I primarily focus on state and local policy for local work that involves the City of New York, and then statewide and state level advocacy efforts which cover a number of topics, and homelessness, in particular, family homelessness, is one of them. I would like to acknowledge 3 of my colleagues who really spend or have spent a lot of their time leading some of our family homelessness efforts. So Tanisha Hines, Elizabeth Ginsburg, and Michelle Mulcahy. Extra thanks to them for their work in programs such as Come Home NYC, a former program that we led that really was connecting participating landlords with homeless families to ensure that they were placed in units, in particular units that were not concentrated, and also for the role that Elizabeth and Michelle played as enterprise co-leads the Family Homelessness Coalition with the Citizens Committee for Children and New Destiny. One thing that I'd certainly like to mention, given the topic, is our office over the last few years has really been going through a slow transformation of trying to figure out how we engage our work that we do from a policy perspective program, as well as the capital work that we do through a racial equity lens, acknowledging that it's no longer just enough to say that we support communities that we work in, that we serve, but how do we engage those communities to have them be a part of helping to address the problems, and as you mentioned, Tierra, particularly given the current climate that we're living in. So happy to be a part. Thank you to the network, and looking forward to the conversation with my co-panelists.
Thanks, Lorraine, and thank you for acknowledging Tanisha and Elizabeth and Michelle. Appreciate all of the work that all of you do, and I'm really glad that you pointed out that we've been having this conversation too and incorporating in a really substantive way people who are having those lived experiences, and something similar to what Antoine said in his introduction. Maddox, do you want to go ahead and give your spiel? You're also getting some shout outs in the chat too.
Yeah, hi everyone.
These panel streets.
I also got to say to y'all, that was a great coordination when you came in with the music. That was great. Hi everyone. Maddox, Guerilla. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns. I identify myself as a visionary, an organizer, artist, advocate, and consultant on youth homelessness in the city. I'm also a co-chair of the Youth Action Board in New York City, and I am a huge believer and enthusiast in the idea of protopia. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, but I really believe of the role of imagination and innovation in the field of youth homelessness. I'm a huge advocate for that, and I think that now more than ever, we need to, hone into that and really amplify our visionary thinking and our visionary approaches.
Absolutely. I'm really excited to hear, you talked a little bit about before your science fiction and organizing and how those things intertwine. So I'm really excited to get to that. But before we do, so the flow of this, I want to ground us in some historical context with Antoine sharing some of the policies that he feels may have impacted homelessness in the Black community. And then again, we'll talk a little bit about the present context with Lorraine and the work that Enterprise has been doing, and then what a protopia could potentially look like. So Antoine, do you want to share with us some of the most glaring policies you believe have impacted communities that lead to our current homelessness crisis?
Absolutely. So before I start, I just want to say that I'm a truth seeker and a truth teller. So I just want to frame my discussion with that piece, and just say that all institutions are white supremacist institutions. So therefore, they will not work on the behalf of Black and brown folk. So that's something that we just have to acknowledge so that we can actually go forward by using an anti-racist lens. And so for economic inequality, that is the main reason why we have homelessness, right? Due to economic inequality, the economy or the market doesn't work on behalf of Black and brown folk. And when you look at the labor market, it is likely that Black and brown folk will be either terminated or not let into these institutions so that they can pay market rent. And that's a problem. So when we look at African-American women, they have to deal with racism and sexism. Latinos have to deal with racism and sexism, and they can't make anywhere near the full dollar. If you can't make anywhere near the full dollar, you're not going to be able to pay market rent in New York City or any large city. And that's a problem. And that's where we have to start looking at equity. How do we build equity into organizations so that people can actually enter and do well? And also using an intersectional lens, understanding that race, gender, sexual orientation, when they are combined or intersect, it causes different dynamics that happen. And we have to understand how that occurs. I also want to look at just child support policies in New York City, or just on a federal level, but New York City and how Black men are disproportionately incarcerated because of child support policies. Because we only look at the economic well-being of a child, but not the social well-being of a child. We know that Black men won't make the full dollar, so therefore they won't be able to pay what's labeled as, caring for the child in terms of the financial support. Research shows that Black and brown fathers spend more time with their children, while white fathers spend less time, but they're able to give the financial support that's needed. You can recover from poverty, but you can't recover from being emotionally destroyed. But we don't build that into our child support policies, and that's a problem. Research also shows that when the father is incarcerated or his driver's license is taken away, he blames the child. That's breaking up families. And we see these economic policies are going to destroying Black and brown families, but we don't address those in our housing policies, right? We see them as separate when they aren't separate, okay? Also, when I think about the right to counsel in New York City, it's the beginning of a great program, but not good enough. It's a means-tested program that looks at the poverty guidelines. We know that the poverty guidelines are outdated. They're geographically incorrect. How can we look at the right to counsel and make it a universal program and not means-tested? Means-tested programs are discriminatory on their faces. So how do we make it a universal program so that everyone can benefit from them? Someone making $30,000 or $40,000 is not rich in New York City. Someone making $25,000 in New York City is not rich, and they need to have an attorney. So that's something that's an issue. And that goes back to economic inequality. And just the housing market alone. We know that when areas are gentrified, it pushes out Black and brown residents. They are no longer needed in the area. They've stayed there, they've done the work, they've survived, they've tried to thrive in the neighborhoods, but they're not included in their environment. Whenever you introduce whiteness into a neighborhood, the rent will go up. Right? There's a tax added to it. So when white individuals move into a neighborhood, obviously the property values will go up, and a landlord can then charge more rent. And that pushes out Black and brown residents. So how do we build equity into our housing policies, also into real estate in New York City? Right? Who's allowed in and who's allowed out? How do we ensure that FHAs, right, are accessible to Black and brown communities? Because it's not just giving people FHA loans, it's also ensuring that they have a down payment, that they have the credit to get the FHA. If I'm just barely surviving on my income that's discriminatory in the labor market, I'm using credit cards to subsidize my life. So therefore, I'm not even gonna have an opportunity to buy a home. And that goes back to the labor market and how it discriminates against Black and brown people. African-American women are the most educated in the United States out of any population, although they aren't given the same opportunities as their white counterparts. But they're also saddled with student loan debt because of the history or the legacy of slavery, segregation, and racism in the labor market. And these are some of the items that we don't address when we look at housing and homelessness. And also, we've divested in public housing. We know that for me, my family received a NYCHA Section 8 voucher. And I'm here speaking with you because of that Section 8 voucher. I think back to when my family went back to NYCHA and handed our Section 8 voucher back in, because we had gone through our journey. We were finished with our journey, right? Our housing and homelessness journey. We need to ensure that every homeless family has a Section 8 voucher, and not a Section 8 voucher with a work requirement. That's also discriminatory. It says that you are lazy. Because then that's when we're going back to racist stereotypes about Black and brown folk, that if they're given some type of assistance, that they don't want to work. When that's not true. When we look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics.gov, it shows that Latino men work the hardest. They have about 80% labor force participation rate, right? And that's higher, much higher than their white counterparts. Mm-hmm. But we shouldn't use racist stereotypes or embed them into most of our policies, and we do. Right? We embed racist stereotypes into our policies, and we want to make sure that we move forward from that. But that's first addressing white supremacy and how it is embedded in every institution and every policy.
Ooh, that was a lot to unpack there, boy, I tell you. I think that what you initially talked about with economic inequality and how child support is racist, it drives mass incarceration. And then when your license is suspended, it makes it more difficult to actually gain employment because there are a lot of stipulations, especially, for working class folks who are, driving trucks or taxis or things like that. You need to have a license in order to get a job. But also the impact that incarceration has on Black men in general, it makes it very difficult to come back out into the workforce. We saw this right now, really, in California with prisoners actually putting out some of the fires, but aren't certified to come out and join the labor market as firefighters, and how that really disenfranchises people on more than one level. The separation of families, right? You're taking Black men and you're putting them in jail. They're no longer able to care for their families. The Black women in low-income communities are getting evicted because now they can't afford the rent, and how that impacts children. And that leads to behavioral health issues, right? And the need for medical attention and therapy, and those things are inaccessible and unaffordable to a lot of families. And that also can, lead to people feeling unsettled and drives homelessness, right? So all of these things, I think we're starting to recognize how all of these systems interact with each other, but not really recognizing it as a driver of actual homelessness. There's a lot of people who think that homelessness is a personal issue. You are doing drugs, or you were doing this, or you weren't able to do this, and they look at that as a personal issue, and not how all of these systems actually intersect with each other.
Yeah, actually, when you look at the labor market, it shows that when you are discriminated against on the labor market, you're probably more likely to live further away from your job, which causes a longer commute. People who get less sleep are more likely to be obese. They're more likely to have a weaker heart. So it's almost like a death sentence, right, due to discrimination.
Yep.
And I want to add too, all of this is making me think, all the extra over policing, all of that, especially in NYCHA. I mean, I always thought how it's called the projects. You know what I mean? That is intentional. It's literally a project on Black and brown people on how their livelihood can or cannot thrive. And for me, I always think about how a lot of these government assistance and, these projects are very intentional, where I think back to my mom, when I was younger, and my mom would always say, I can't get a higher paying job, or, I just can't get a higher paying job. I have to stay where I am because I'll lose my benefits and I'll lose what I have. And is this way that they kind of say we're giving you this assistance, but even that assistance is limiting to not even allow people to be able to grow and maybe expand because the support isn't there, and as Antoine mentioned, there's a lot of trauma already with the over policing that comes and how that affects you as a being. And when we look at a lot of our systems aren't necessarily built by being trauma informed, we know that a lot of runaway homeless youth have a lot of trauma. And when we go into these institutions, there needs to be some sort of I don't like the word rehabilitation because I feel like it has negative connotation, but there needs to be more love, just more love put into the way that we interact, more compassion, because like Antoine mentioned, these systems are rooted in white supremacy, they're rooted in disposability, and they're rooted in politics that aren't really there to uplift us, more to police us and keep us stagnant.
And if I could weigh in, because I think Maddox, the point that you made goes back to how Antoine really opened us up, and it's looking at who's setting and creating the system and who continues the system. So if there's no one with lived experience, there's no one who's in a position who has that compassion, there's no one who can, a client can look in the mirror and say, I can see this person has gone through what I've gone through or can relate, that's in a position of power, that's in a decision-making position, that's connected to how resources flow from government to philanthropy, so on and so forth. So it is approaching the entire system, and how do we do that in a way where we're lifting up voices and we're not comfortable with poverty. If we're just comfortable with the Band-Aid solutions, have no intention on getting to the root of the issue, we'll just see this cycle for our generations. Our parents saw it in their generations, our grandparents saw it in their generations, and our children's children's children will just continue to see it.
Yeah, there's a really great article by Herbert Gans, 1972, The Positive Function of Poverty. And he clearly states that, listen, there's a function for poverty in society. And when you think about homeless providers, right, there's a function for continuing homelessness. We shall not be case managers, right? We shouldn't be managing cases. We should be ensuring that people have access to resources so that they can live independently. And that's probably the most important point that I can make. Yeah. Right? We have to start doing a structural analysis on not just white supremacist institutions, but homeless providers, right? We are only successful if we put ourselves out of business. There should be no use for us anymore, right? So, and that's important, right? We should be working towards ending homelessness, not keeping and maintaining it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a really great point. I have a couple of follow-up questions that I want to ask you, Antoine, about gentrification and the disinvestment in public housing, but I'm going to save those real quick. We got a couple mic drops in the chat. Yes, I agree with you. Lorraine, I do want to make sure that we get to you and some of the things that Enterprise has been working on. We talked a little bit about mass incarceration and how that drives homelessness and how it impacts Black communities. I want to talk a little bit about the development of justice-involved housing. We talked about Section 8 vouchers. So, I want you to talk a little bit about the source of income discrimination laws that Enterprise has been working on and some other things. Lorraine, I don't see you. Did you pop off? Oh, there you go.
I'm here.
Yeah. Okay. Oh. So based on your experience advocating for these policies at the state level, can you speak to some of the ways that some of these policies can help rectify the harm?
Sure. And, I'll start by saying that reparations could be a starting point, but I know that's an entirely different workshop and conference altogether. But that said, I do go back to, this concept of policy and its impact. And, I feel like Antoine was, peeking on my notes, because one of the things that I had written down that I wanted to raise is that it's policies that increase financial and other resources, as well as housing choice, that's important. And I do feel that oftentimes in the conversations that we have regarding homelessness, there isn't a lot that's spoken of regarding financial resources and how that intersects with health policy, education policy, economic development policy, including both job creation as well as entrepreneurship, so that you are, to a certain extent, owning your portion of the system. I also, before I go into some specific policy recommendations that Enterprise has been working on, feeding again off of what Antoine shared, he mentioned, Black women being like the most educated women in America. I just want to throw out some statistics from one of our co-workers or co-sponsors with the Family Homeless Coalition that I mentioned, CCC. They produced an infographic in 2017. And some of the highlights from that was that more than 2/3 of the population in DHS shelters were families with children. When you break that down into racial demographics, the vast majority of homeless families are Black and Hispanic. break that down a bit further. Although family households only make up 23% of the family household population across New York City, they make up 57% of the households that are in shelters. For Hispanic families, that is 28% of the family households in the city and 37% of the family households that are in shelters. So we can see that there definitely is a lot to what's already been said and how that plays out in who is homeless, why they're homeless, and these many different factors. The economics of it is certainly one we know, and don't want to discount, domestic violence and some other concerns and issues, but how do we begin or try to address those? From a housing perspective, Tierra, as you mentioned, there are a number of things that Enterprise has been working on in recent months. A couple that I'd like to call out, as you mentioned, from a source of income discrimination perspective, Enterprise co-leads a statewide source of income coalition, which resulted in a hashtag ban income bias NY campaign that was advocating for amending the New York State Human Rights Law to include source of income as protected class, and then that switched to hashtag end income bias. When we look at source of income discrimination, often it's a proxy for other forms of discrimination, race being probably near the top or at the top, disability, and familial status. And so when you put all of those protected classes together, who are you visualizing? You're visualizing a single Black or Hispanic mother with children. And so with that discrimination, you're limiting choice. You're limiting the ability of those individuals and families to find stable housing that they can afford. You're limiting, oftentimes it also includes where they can live because you have had this discrimination on the books or without having the legislation on the books to actually combat. And then for cities who have had this type of legislation on the books, then you have the issue with enforcement. So if no one is enforcing the law, and we've all just been comfortable with the law just being passed, that becomes a problem, in and of itself. And then to tie that back to homelessness, while I don't know to what extent stats are available, certainly there have been a lot of anecdotal conversations and information shared in terms of how we can tie the shelter stay and the homelessness stay with SOY discrimination. So if I am a single mother with children and I'm looking for housing, I have some form of rental assistance, but I'm constantly being denied the opportunity to use this rental assistance. My family ends up in shelters longer. Say things don't work out at shelter, I'm doubling or tripling up with a family member or friend. And then in worst case scenario leads to street homelessness or, leaving the city of New York or wherever a family may have close knit ties to. And so this is all, very problematic, and particularly when we think about the amount of resources that we spend to house individuals and families in shelters, as opposed to the resources that could be used to, again, to help lift and help better the lives of those individuals or families to prevent them falling into homelessness altogether. And that also includes, again, the policies and the legislation that gets passed at the local level as well as at the state level. Switching it a little bit in terms of thinking about providing and getting housing stock actually on the ground. How do we increase and combat some of the racialized policies that have been in place? We talk a lot about exclusionary zoning. I'm sure most, if not everyone who's on today have or can relate to a story where there's a concern or issue with the zoning laws that are in place either in a neighborhood, in the community, in a municipality, and what that means for where people of color reside, what opportunities from a housing perspective that they have access to, and what that and how that impacts their lives, all across the board. And so one of the things that Enterprise has engaged with as we co-convened Regional Affordable and Fair Housing Roundtable with the Fair Housing Justice Center is looking at some policy recommendations that would support increasing the amount of housing stock. And one of those is the concept of a statewide fair share housing plan, similar to what states such as New Jersey, Massachusetts, and more recently, California have approved. And so in essence, what this does is ensure that there's a minimum percent of affordable housing, both rental as well as homeownership, that a community has to be responsible for, in an effort to, again, help to put housing stock in place, help to combat NIMBYism, and help to make sure that folks are being housed in safe and decent and in an affordable way. One of the things as we continue to work through how this could look in this environment, in this climate, one, I think it's probably the best climate, particularly in the city of New York and at the state level, given the political and social justice unrest that's occurring, for there to be a push to get some of these types of laws on the books. But the warning in that is that it can't just be about the housing stock. It has to be also about how we impact the lives of people in the community. There has to be a lens of racial justice in what type of housing is being provided, who can afford it, where is it being sited, how does that also lead into an equity building or wealth building opportunity for individuals.
Ooh, again, lot to unpack there. A lot to unpack there. There's, you know, the source of income discrimination definitely plays a part in folks not being able to access quality housing, but it's also just the amount of the vouchers, right? So when we talk about making sure that we are sort of investing in folks, you know, the divestment in public housing like we were talking about, it's also this idea that rents are steadily going up, voucher amounts are not going up, and folks are barred from paying anything above their voucher if they don't have the funds to actually pay for it. So a lot of other stuff to unpack there, and I have so many questions for you, Lorraine. But I want Maddox to hop on really quickly if none of you have any follow-up questions for Lorraine, and talk about a little bit about your Protopia vision. And where you see us going when we are really looking at our society through a racial justice and equity lens and trying to build up the most marginalized communities.
Yeah, so first I'll start by saying, when I talk about Protopia, I always like to amplify to folks that even the way that we're given to imagine, the terms that we're given to be able to imagine are binary, right? Like there's a dystopian world that's just doomed, you know, it's like, oh, the world's gonna go down. And then there's the utopian world that's like, yeah, it could happen, but it's a fantasy. And Protopia just kind of dismantles all of that and puts us in the driver's seat, because Protopia is the idea that every day we work towards the world we want to see, so that it is possible. It's just acknowledging that it takes work, and it's every day showing up to do that work. And so I love this ideology. I always love to pass it on to people to share, because I think that the way that we imagine is powerful. And as we mentioned before, like this society really tries to take us away from imagining and really tries to keep us in the patterns and systems and ideologies that exist to oppress us, not to free us. And so in that, I am a big believer in sci-fi and organizing. I love the work of Adrienne Marie Brown and Walida Marisha. I encourage y'all to check them out for more, just more context on sci-fi, organizing being sci-fi. Walida Marisha has this quote where she says that when organizers are imagining and dreaming that world, that is sci-fi, because we are dreaming them. So that means that we can actually make that happen. I always tell people, as a visionary, I have to realize that a lot of things I may dream of are out of the current reality, but that doesn't mean that we cannot not get to that reality, that we can get to that reality. It just takes some work. I think about the importance of representation in sci-fi. You know, when we think about Black Panther and the for me, like, that was just even amazing to know that we as Black folks, like, are like the Marvel universe, you know, like that plays a big role in the consciousness and the consciousness of young people and in our world and the way that we exist. And we have a representation of us there and like what our fighting looks like, right? Because if you think about Marvel and all those things, they're all about fighting and like their styles, but it's showing us what, like how you know, we think about the Black Panther Party. And I know I did a little research, and actually I forgot the person who does the Marvel comments, but he came up with the character of Black Panther around the 1960s when the Black Panthers were actually out here. So, you know, that there's definitely correlation between that and that movement and the current pop media. You know, and thinking about that, you know, I think about the Black Panthers when we think about how can we organize and strategize outside of our current political reality. We have to think about our ancestors and the work that they did when, you know, they saw issues with the system and they said, like, we're going to take it upon our own hands. I love the Black Panthers kind of ideology around first giving people their survival needs, right? Like providing housing, providing healthcare, providing food for folks, and providing education for folks, you know, like these are the three pillars that the government really, and housing government really tries to oppress us with and chain us by. And they said, no, we're going to provide this for our people and we're going to be the ones to initiate it, you know. And then there's programs that we benefit from today that were started from, you know, the Black Panthers Initiative. So we really have to think about that. And you know, a lot of times people are like, oh, with the politics and all of that, but how do we as a people, as a mass, gain back our power and organize within our communities to make sure that folks have what they need, their survival needs met? Because I always say, like, as a visionary, I know that people can't begin to think critically and consciously if their needs are not met. Like, that's just not realistic. You know, people's needs need to be met in order for people to even begin to think more critically or consciously. And, you know, right now there's a lot of talk about around defunding the police. I'm more leaning towards the side of abolition. Just to clarify, when people are saying defund the police, they're talking about taking away income, divesting from the police, and, you know, spreading that money to social services. But that does mean that there's still a possibility of police existing, just not at the capacity that they have. Whereas abolition is a society where we don't have to police each other. Maybe there are other systems of holding each other accountable and recognizing harm, but that they're not so punitive and, you know, harmful, and they're more grounded in a restorative process. And so for me, I say, as we're talking about abolishing the police, we also have to think about abolishing the police in our head. You know, a lot of, like Antoine mentioned about these white supremacist institutions, you know, we come into the nonprofit and we lose our humanity for folks, and we start to prioritize institutions and laws and bureaucracies over truly helping and supporting people. You know, like, we really have to shift that, and especially now more than ever, really prioritize the lives of people over, you know, keeping an institution alive and thriving. And I think that even the work from on the ground, you know, folks on the ground do inspire institutions. You know, when we think about mutual aid and the ways that our community takes care of themselves, and we always will, you know, we think about the queer community, where like the original host homes, right? Like, people in the queer community were providing housing and shelter because we know the disparity that LGBTQ young people face. And, you know, the government has never recognized that, but we recognize that. And we know, like, the inspiration and the, you know, the effect that we have on society. And I think more recently now, there's talk in New York City about potential cash transfer program. And I really believe that work does, of course, it comes from the folks who've been organizing and advocating for that for years, but also I think that it's inspiration from folks on the ground doing mutual aid. Like, I've seen folks in my community beautifully raise hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to refunnel into our community directly. You know, I think that that's a little bit of the issues with the nonprofit industrial complex, is that when I can only speak for New York, but when I look at New York City, sometimes we get hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars being funneled into institutions. But when we go on the ground, you know, like the disparity that people are facing, it's not there. Like people aren't receiving the services as they're written. You know, we were talking about vouchers earlier, and a friend of mine once told me that there was a foil pulled on I believe the DHS system. And like out of, let's say the numbers are not accurate, but just to give a little ratio to show what it would look like, out of like 2,000 people going into the shelter system, about 5 are receiving vouchers. So, you know, like those are some huge, or supportive housing, those are some huge disparities that we need to be looking at data in that way, not just looking at data in the sense that like, oh, it's uplifting that we're doing this work and it looks great on paper, but actually analyzing data on our community. Like, how is it being ineffective? How we're getting these millions and hundreds of thousands of dollars, but on the ground, we're not seeing that level of service. So I'm very interested in us, you know, looking at data in that way, being more community orientated versus just providing data for the city. And I think that also we have to recognize that around, you know, in the 60s through the 80s, there was large organizing happening. And I'm talking about like radical organizing, like folks, you know, taking over buildings, squatting, you know, doing these kind of radical movement. We also know that there was a lot of over policing around that time. In the 80s, there was huge over policing, especially around, you know, radical thinking and visionary approaches. And that had an effect in our society, because if we look at the timeline, in the 90s is when there's an upsurge of nonprofits coming in, right? And then, in my opinion, nonprofits hijacked the radical work on the ground, because now that's what's replacing, you know, people. I can talk about my own experience, right? When I got into this work, I thought like, I don't want to be corporate, nonprofits is where it's at. And I unfortunately learned that is not where it's at, you know, that there's a whole nonprofit industrial complex in place to kind of distract us from being more radical and really organizing our communities and ourselves and taking initiatives. Because I don't believe that we always need an outsider or a foreigner to come in and service us. I don't remember who said this, but someone said that the folks who are closest to the problem are the ones that have the answer. And I believe that if the most marginalized are not prioritized, then none of us is safe. If the most marginalized person is not safe, then none of us are safe. If Black trans women are not safe, none of us are safe. So we have to keep this in mind as we move forward. And especially now more than ever, we really have to challenge ourselves to be visionary and radical and not be okay with replicating the systems that we have, because we have seen those systems crumble in the last couple of months, and we have an opportunity to get, you know, start new patterns. And we're talking about this now, but it's very important that we implement that so that we get to that protopia, so that we get to that just society. And for me, that just means really prioritizing people over policies. And there's a way to do that.
And to follow up on Maddox, you know, people say that telling the truth and fairness is radical, right? And it's just really, it's not, right? It's about fairness and equity and equality. And I firmly believe in collectivism, right? And it goes back to that Beyonce song, right? We have to get into, very much so. And I think, you know, when you look at homeless individuals or those in public housing, if you bring us all together, right, we have a lot of power, right? We need to be able to vote, right? In a New York City that's majority minoritized, right? We can come together and ensure that our voices are heard. Or we will vote you out of office and bring someone in who will do the work that we need to be done. And that's really what it is that, but that's what happens with poverty. It separates people, right? And it's on purpose. And also, when you think about the right to shelter in New York City, it should be a right to housing, right? Not shelter, to housing. And that needs to be changed. And these community-based organizations need to collectively come together and ensure that that's updated, because it needs to be updated. People don't need to be in shelters, right? But there's a cost that go along with housing people in shelters. And it goes back to this complex. But we need to ensure that people have homes. We have to look at intergenerational transmission of homelessness, right? Not just the individual, right? But their parents, right? Their grandparents, right? Because if we look back, we can see what people are. I look at my mom who was homeless, my grandmother who was homeless, and then I was homeless, right? There's a transmission then. Of course, there's just like generational poverty a bit there, but if we can do some intervention research to figure out what we can incorporate to prevent that from happening, that's the work that really should be done.
And just, Emerald, this may be too radical again for this particular platform.
Lorraine, let it out. No.
In creating, you know, a Wakanda, if you will, you know, I do wonder if the closest that will come to that or see what could become of that is what's taking place in Georgia with the Freedom Georgia initiative that made the news a few weeks ago. Because it's, in essence, at least based on what my understanding is, they're looking to create something from the ground up, you know, on their own, you know, these families and then those who are, who are Black or sensitive to the Black experience. You know, I just do think in terms of the time it will take to catch up from or close the racial wealth gap, the timing it will take to turn over these systems, you know, how many different lifetimes does that look like? Because as Antoine kicked us off, it's the fabric of this entire nation. And, you know, that's tough to dismantle, but for these experiences and these opportunities where you are able to coalesce around an idea and get buy-in and have unity and move forward. Or it's, okay, let's see if we could start from scratch. And what does sci-fact look like in starting from scratch? How can we create our own?
We know that incrementalism doesn't work, right? It just maintains the status quo, right? And what we've done historically is dehumanize Black and brown people. And when you dehumanize people, it's easier to discriminate against them because they become the other. And that's what we continue to do, right? When you give them a label of criminal, right? When you say that they're not educated and you do these other pieces, right? They intersect and it causes this dehumanization to occur. And that's what we do with homeless people. We walk by them every single day, right? And not see them in the street and not acknowledge them. That is someone's grandparent, that is someone's mother, that is someone's father, right? That is a life that you're walking by. Acknowledge it, do something about it. What is your mission? What is your directive, right, for your day, or this mission that you have as a person to eradicate homelessness is what you should be thinking. How can you step over a homeless person on your way to a job to eradicate homelessness in your community? That doesn't make sense.
Thank you so much for saying that, because I put myself right on the Summer Jam screen. Somebody said last week, that's something that I grappled with living in New York City all the time. Honestly, it was a real struggle for me. I do want to mention, Lorraine mentioned the Georgia project, that there were some folks in Philadelphia just recently who took over some city-owned houses and staked their claim to it and actually won that. So that is the kind of radical thinking and radical organizing and that collectivism, that community organizing, folks on the ground doing the work that we are talking about. This has been great. I do want to get to a little bit of some audience questions. We have about 10 minutes left. I feel like we never have enough time for these discussions. We might need to reconsider that. So let's see. So a question we have from the Q&A is, how can we build the bridge between those drafting policies and those impacted? So when we're talking about that the people on the ground are the ones closest to the answers, the people closest to the problem are the ones closest to the answers. We've had several iterations of this question being asked and answered, but from all of your perspectives, especially when we're reimagining and revisioning what Protopia in theory could look like, how do we bridge that gap? And this is open.
Yeah, I mean, for me, well, one thing, well, I'll say this first. For me, like at this point, like no policy, none of that, like that stuff shouldn't be drafted without people who are directly impacted, because obviously people who are like that quote, they're the ones that are going to have the most answers. And I think that we have to check ourselves, because they're like, this is white supremacy, this is condescending, disrespectful thinking when we think that people with lived experience do not, like, their expertise is not valuable for whatever reason. Like, we're not going to listen to them. And, you know, we can't continue to do that because there's so many brilliant, amazing people in our communities that have the answers. But because of this, you know, internal dominance that, like, oh, well, you know what, they're homeless, they didn't go to school, like, why would I listen to them? Like, you know, we have to go away with that and really support them. I always tell people that, you know, people think that it's radical to bring somebody to the table, which is so ridiculous, but we don't want to just be brought to the table. We want to build our own table and then our own house, not even a table, we want a house. And if you want to help us, just help us build that house. Like, if you have, I used to always tell people this before, but, like, you know, with grant writing and grant receiving, folks who have that expertise, they can, like, work with, you know, communities who have initiative collective and help them get that money. You know, I think it makes me think about funding and how so much of funding, like, that's this whole other world, but a lot of funding is about proximity and institutions. But, you know, people who are directly impacted doing that work, they don't get that funding. And I think now we're seeing a switch. I do want to recognize that, you know, we're seeing a switch now and more people are investing into community initiatives, but we need to see more of that, right? We need to see more folks, like, you know, I think it's great. So, like, the folks, like Black trans folks who are building tiny homes for trans people, like, you know, like, we have to, like, uplift them and give them money versus, like, we're just going to keep funneling money into, like, the DHS system because that's just, you know, what we're used to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I hear from Maddox is that, yes, we have to ensure that the environment is diverse, but also you need diversity and inclusion. Right? It doesn't work if you don't include people, right? Don't just sit me at the table and tell me to shut up so that, you know, it looks like you've opened the door to some. And we have to change that. A bottom-up approach to policymaking is the most effective way of going at the problem. We know that the top 1%, even in community-based organizations, it's still the top 1%. They're making decisions for people at the very bottom and they don't even know what's going on. Mm-hmm. That's problematic. My dissertation was at emerging adults in public housing and their perception of the future. And I spoke to young adults, 18 to 24, in NYCHA public housing. They told me exactly what they needed to ensure a positive future. Like, I mean, it just go to them and they will tell you what the problem is. Implement your policies that way. Yep. Not by assumptions, not by stereotypes, right? Not about the conversations you're having in your gentrified communities.
And the two things that I'll mention first, I'll echo what Maddox and Antoine just said. And one of the things that we're trying to do at Enterprise, certainly aren't there yet and in the early stages, but have recognized that with setting our policy priorities as an organization, as we think about our collaboration with the network and others, how are we hearing from folks who are most impacted or directly impacted? And so, you know, term we're using is, you know, a grounded approach. And so what does that look like? And some of the things that we've thrown out, well, it's who's on our policy committee. It's when we are pulling together a campaign, who's part of that campaign? When we're coming up with our policy priorities, how are we enlisting feedback and who are we enlisting feedback from? And trying to, you know, because the way our organization is structured, trying to work through how do we get as closest to the impacted person as possible in hearing that voice, but not just hearing that voice so that Enterprise looks good. And this is something, I'm going to shout out a group I actually just met this week called Connected Communities here in the city of Rochester. And they have what's called a resident ambassador program. And it's structured to do just that. How do we hear from residents within the community, within specific neighborhoods, to ensure that they have a buy-in into what's happening within their neighborhoods, but not just let's get their ideas and that's that. They're being paid, offered a stipend as part-time employees. There's a connection with one of the local colleges for them to receive some mentorship as well as some guidance in bringing the ideas that they're coming up with to light. And that what all of that does is also puts things on their resume so that they can see the fruits of their labor, but they're also growing productively. Again, let's lift up out of poverty. So I think that's a great model. I'm waiting to learn more because I think it's something that definitely, you know, could be scaled. The other piece is who makes the decisions? Elected officials make the decisions. So who's running for office and who's being elected. I think taking a strong, hard look, and certainly we've seen in the state of New York at the state level where you have young people, younger generation who are willing to, take that leap of faith to put together a campaign and be elected. And being able to see whether it's age, whether it's based on lived experience, or all of those things combined. It's who are you putting your trust in, and then holding people accountable once they get there. It's vote you in, but we'll vote you out. It's, you know what, you have great ideas. Maddox, would you consider running for city council? Just putting it out there. But it's those natural, organic conversations that may take place while you're just kicking it, in the kitchen or in this day, in the backyard, that leads to things. And then how do we, as lobbyists, I understand the importance of lobbying, but how do we minimize that voice of those with the deepest pockets who could care less about the people?
Yeah, I just don't believe that tax dollars should be given to community-based organizations that don't have a diverse board of directors or leadership team. I, as a Black or brown person in New York City, would not like to pay taxes and then have those tax dollars go to support my own oppression.
Mm-hmm. Hello. We are really short on time. I do want to mention one thing, though, about our political system and mass incarceration and how it oppresses Black and brown people. You are actually barred from running for public office if you have a felony conviction, which we know 1 in 3 Black men are going to be arrested in their time, right? So that's another way that we not only disenfranchise people in the voting system, but actually having them engage in public office. I would like each of you in our last couple of minutes to give our audience one action step or item or something to walk away with to help, inspire, encourage all of us in this fight. One thing.
I recently went back to the shelter that I lived in the Bronx, under Bronx Works. And I spoke to some young kids there. We spoke about racism, structural barriers, and they were 7, 8, or 9. And in them, I saw lawyers, doctors, engineers, the next president of the United States. And I know that there's so much potential in these places, but poverty prevents people from moving forward. It prevents progress. And I know that if we do right by these groups, they'll be the next change agents. And that's what our goal should be, to ensure that people are going in and changing these organizations so that they can work better for the people that they should be serving.
Thanks, Antoine. Lorraine? I put you on the spot with this question, I'm sorry, but one action item.
No, I would just say, get involved. Certainly making the connection in your neighborhood, with friends, if you can elevate that voice to the nonprofit that's in your neighborhood, coalitions that you're hearing about, or coalitions that you're the one who needs to start it. I think get involved. I didn't have a homeless experience, but I'm the descendants of folks who my grandparents migrated from the state of Florida in the 40s and 50s. And, my parents were working parents, lived in public housing for the first years of my life. And, I look about all that experience, life experience, with my academic background. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get involved with my profession.
Maddox, I just want to thank you, Lorraine. Maddox, I just want to say I'm all for you running for office. And if you need a campaign manager, hit me up. I probably shouldn't say that. I might get in trouble with our
I'll keep that in mind. I thought about it, but it's a little stressful. Plus, what y'all just mentioned about, if you got arrested and stuff like that. What was I going to say? Well, one thing I want to say is in your organizations and in your work, just trust Black leadership, trust the Black folks you're working with, definitely check the anti-Blackness in the organization. And be open to innovation. You know what I mean? I know, like I said, we have to acknowledge that it's outside of the box. You know, it's not currently our current reality, but that we can get there. And just don't be like dismissive of people's ideas. You know, a lot of time people hear something that seems like unachievable or like, you know, challenging to happen. And they're like, oh, don't talk about it. We can't, don't do that. You know, don't have that reaction. If you do have that reaction, breathe it out. And, you know, try to let that sink in, and be open to innovation and new ideas, because that's the only way that will get to a new place.
You know, I'm so sorry to have to let you all go. Seriously, we're over time. I just want to, you know, this panel it's being recorded. It'll be posted on our website, on our YouTube channel. Make sure that you follow the network on Twitter and Instagram at the Network NY. Register for the rest of our Friday forums. If you enjoyed this discussion and the one last week, trust me, we have more to come. This isn't the end. These discussions are going to be flowing all through the month of October into early November. You know, check out Antoine and Lorraine and Maddox's work for sure. You know, Google them. You'll want to follow these folks from here on out for sure. Thank you, folks. I feel like we never have enough time, but this was great. It was so inspiring. It gave me a lot to think about. I'm sure it's from the chat. It looks like it gave a lot of people some things to think about and chew on. I appreciate all of the work that all of you are doing sincerely, and all of the time it took for us to pull this together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tierra.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tierra.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.